Hi. So I have a situation where I think I would like to have a Linux server running on my network at all times. One of the functions that it would be providing is communicating with a block device. I have a old hard drive enclosure that takes two hard drives in it, and you have to connect to it as a block device. There's a special driver for Windows, but it's really buggy and problematic. But there is an open source driver that somebody designed for it to be used on Linux. And while my routers are Linux based, they're running a version of DD-WRT firmware, open source firmware. The one I'm using is called Tomato USB, but it does not have the capability of connecting to NBD network block devices in its kernel, and of course I would also need that custom driver that somebody developed. So I can't really use the routers as the devices that are constantly connected to the block device. So I need a server, and I have a really ancient dinosaur machine. I don't know if you remember, there was a brand called E-Machines. It was a cheap brand for really basic PCs that would get you through dial-up online, and they were designed for Windows 95, 98. I don't remember exactly, but that's what it feels like. This machine has a 400 megahertz CPU and 180 megs of RAM. So the question is, can you run Linux on it? And I at first tried to install a lightweight Linux that I've been familiar with for years called Antix or Anti-X. The guy who keeps maintaining the distribution, his nickname is Anticapitalista, and it's out of Greece. It's based out of Greece somewhere, so much that when you install it, your apt-get sources list configuration file is pointing to servers in Greece, and you have to change it to point to a mirror in the US. But in any case, I tried to install Antix, and it was too heavy for the PC, which is no surprise. And generally, I think X Windows or GUI is not going to work for this computer. The live distribution of Antix actually started. It was using a Windows manager called Slim. So I may want to look into that and see if I can install that. But what I did is I decided to go with the Debian install, with a pure Debian install, because it's very versatile. I have also used it for years, but I normally install Linux Mint on my computers. But I've installed Debian on occasion. It used to be a little harder to deal with Debian, with pure Debian, because it doesn't have as many convenient graphical utilities for you to configure various software. But there's Google, and a lot of people have walked the path that you're walking, and there's a lot of answers, and it's possible to configure Debian to do what you want. And in my case, the first thing I need is this block device, and then I need to install Samba to provide a share for the Windows PCs on my network, and that way I would be able to take advantage of this block device, even though it is super slow. But what I want to do is I want to take advantage of its capability. Well, it has two drives, and the mirroring that you could do, or striping, with the Windows driver. I don't know if that was happening on device or on Windows. On Linux, the person who wrote the driver, could not figure out, that capability of the enclosure. So the mirror would be software based. This is where this Linux server would be maintaining the mirror, and then through Samba share it out. And I want to store sensitive documents in an encrypted container on this drive in a mirrored setup, and also potentially sync up to a cloud storage like Dropbox, for example. And so that way I would be covered, where I would have these important sensitive documents in an encrypted container stored locally on my network and replicated into the cloud as well, just in case the enclosure goes up in smoke and the container becomes inaccessible. So to cover all my bases. So the question is, can you install Debian Stretch, the latest release of Debian? It's version 9.6 right now. That was released on November 28th, 2018. Can you install Debian on this ancient machine? And I've already gone through the process, but I will. But I've recorded the installation process in a time lapse, so perhaps you can glean a little bit of, what was going on. But I will tell you that Debian, what I discovered, I haven't been on Debian's website in a long time, haven't followed the distribution, what was happening with it. But I discovered that, well, first of all, I knew about the network install option that Debian has, and it still has it. It's a ISO file of about 385 megabytes or so. So it easily fits on a regular CD-ROM, which is what I did. I burnt it onto a rewritable CD-ROM, which I have those for years, and they've been working flawlessly. I have rewritten them many, many times. I have, write once CDR, disks that went sour, went out, but these verbatim CD rewritable disks are holding up. I've got other media, other CD writable media that went sour and doesn't work anymore. So in any case, so I burnt the net install and fired up on the machine, but it kept having problems. And the way the net install works, by the way, is that it boots up a minimum Linux kernel on it with the installation program, but it fetches all the packages that you need or that you want to install from the internet, from the storage. You can pick a mirror, you can go to the Debian's storage, or you can pick a mirror that's closer located to you and that might be faster. And so those packages get fetched as you tell Debian installer what it is that you want to have installed. And that's one of the great things about Debian installer, is that if you go into expert mode, you get to choose so many configuration options that you don't get with pretty much any other Linux distribution. Other Linux distributions kind of lock you into what they have prepackaged, and you install it and you have no choice. And many distributions, including Antix, no longer fit on a CD-ROM. You have to have a DVD media, and if you have a really old piece of hardware that doesn't have a DVD-ROM in it and cannot boot from USB, you have a difficult time installing any other distribution. But with Debian, you are still able to fire up net install. So I've been having problems with the net install. I don't know if I'll include the time-lapse video of that in it or not. We'll see. But I then looked at what does Debian have in terms of regular CD-ROM ISO images, and lo and behold, they still have CD-ROM images in 641 megabytes. So the CD-RW media can only fit 650 megabytes. So this ISO would fit perfectly. So I burnt it and then rebooted the machine and tried to install with that media. And I was once again getting errors, and I would have to restart steps in the installation process, but bit by bit I was moving forward, and eventually I ended up with an install, and took out the CD, rebooted the computer, and got the command prompt, logged in, and downloaded the custom network block device driver for the enclosure that I was discussing, and loaded the NBD module into the kernel, attached the drives, and tried to assemble the mirror. And I've got some snags with assembling the mirror, so I'm right now running on just one drive, but I was able to see the files that I already previously had on the device, so I am able to access it. I may have to move the enclosure closer to the server, perhaps going through a Wi-Fi link between two routers. Perhaps that's what makes it problematic to communicate with the enclosure, because, like I said, it's pretty slow, and it's a block device. The block devices are usually connected to servers with things like FireWire, or not FireWire, I'm sorry, fiber channel, if I remember correctly. That might be an outdated technology by now. Or, traditional SCSI. SCSI has been around for forever, and but those block devices are connected directly, where this one is a network block device, which makes communicating with it pretty slow. But for smaller files, it's quite usable, and ability to run mirroring on it, even though software, is fine. And in the case of me wanting to run a Linux server, I used to do that in the past many years ago, but I haven't been running a server in my network. Even though right now I have a pretty decent machine that's installed with Windows Server 2016 or 2017, I forget, the data center edition. I get the license through my graduate student status at the university, so I was able to install that, and also install the version of Microsoft SQL Server with all the bells, the most latest version with all the bells and whistles. My plan is to try to learn Microsoft SQL Server and then maybe return back to my database administrator roots. My background is in Oracle, but I'm thinking to try to learn SQL Server. In any case, that machine is sitting around, but that's a decent machine with 8 gigs of memory, dual core, 3 gigahertz processor, and quite usable for running latest Windows Server and latest SQL Server software just fine. But this old eMachines is 180 megs, 400 megahertz CPU. I forget whether it's Intel or AMD. And I've also put the oldest, crappiest hard drive in it. It's a 6 gigabyte 4000 RPM 4200 RPM hard drive. I wanted to put a compact flash based disk into it, but I can't figure out where in the world did I put that 64 gig compact flash that I had laying around, and the adapters to connect to the IDE interface. I've put them away somewhere and I can't find them. So I wanted to put it into the server, to make it a little snappier and also save on electricity, because this thing is going to run all the time. But that's why this old machine is so good, is because if I was running something beefier, I would be looking at 240, 250 watts being consumed by the machine at all times, where this one has a power supply inside of it that's rated at 120 watts maximum. And so with monitor turned off and just running the terminal without the GUI, the CPU wouldn't really be doing much. So this server would be sort of like having a 100-watt light bulb turned on all the time, so it will probably cost $10 a month in electricity. So that's what's good about because this server doesn't even have a fan on the CPU sink, heat sink in it, so that's not consuming electricity. The only fan is inside the power supply. So that consumes electricity all the time. And then of course the LAN card consumes electricity, the motherboard, the CPU, the north bridge, south bridge, memory, all those things, the hard drive. But it would probably be about 100 watts that it consumes, and that's about at least twice as less than what you would get with pretty much anything newer, even an ancient machine, with a Pentium 4 or something like that, would already be consuming over 200 watts, something like that. So in any case, let me switch to the screen and show you where you get Debian. It's pretty easy. You go to Debian.org, and there's a link that you click on that says Get Debian, and it explains to you quite well what's the network install, what's the DVD ISOs, what's the CD-ROM ISOs. But let me switch the camera onto the screen and give you a quick look. So here I already navigated to the download directory of Debian. Sorry, my hand is shaking with the camcorder. And it, like I said, it provides explanations. So even before you see the download links, you get a lot of explanation about what this is, and of course talks about non-free firmware, because Debian is one of the distributions that has been historically sticking with free and open source software for as default. It in order to get non-free firmware or software, you have to explicitly allow it into the apt-get sources, where distributions like Ubuntu or Linux Mint, they by default include the non-free proprietary drivers and software. So here you have it. You've got download links. See, one of them says net install ISO. The other one says i386 XFCE CD1, and it's 641 megabytes in size. And then there's a Mac net install ISO as well in this directory. But if we scroll up somewhere, there is a if we go back even, let's see, what do we have here? Oh, okay. So this is where I was in a directory called Debian CD current, and I went into the ISO CD, but there's also ISO DVD. So let's click on that. Once again, there's all that explanation that you get. So we scroll down and we see there's a DVD 1, DVD 2, DVD 3. And I imagine that all these additional DVDs, they provide you with options for installing a lot of additional software without having to download it. But I've installed this basic Debian, and even then it was already having LibreOffice included in it. And then the rest of the software, you can easily get it by using the package manager called apt-get, or if you get GUI going, you can use something like Synaptic to locate additional software and additional packages, and you can install just what you need. That's the other beauty of Debian, is that unlike other distributions that basically have everything prepackaged for you, and you end up with the software that they chose, you get all of that installed, and you need somewhere around 10 to 20 gigabytes, depending on the Linux distribution, of space. I've installed this Debian on this old 6 gigabyte hard drive, and it took up only about 2 gigs of space. So it even leaves me room for additional software, and I don't have much of a requirement, just SSH server and maybe TFTP server for doing some electronics projects that require upgrading firmware, and some devices that need a TFTP server to bootstrap themselves. Then have Samba going to provide the share to the block device to the Windows machines, and I don't see myself running a web server. I've tried that years ago, and it's just not my thing. I don't really care for it so much. But in any case, this is where you get Debian, and like I said, I recorded a time lapse. Let's flip the camera. I recorded a time lapse of the installation. I don't really care to make this into a how to install Debian video, because I would take a lot more time. But the prompt, even if you choose the expert install, the prompts for various settings also provide a lot of explanation. So you can make decisions. You can go in the expert install, and you can tweak your install even more to what you need, and you can exclude what you don't need. You can make the configuration such that what you don't need doesn't get included, or does not get configured, doesn't fire up. And so this Debian that I installed on this machine with 180 megabytes of memory, I've created a swap file, and Linux, being smart, offloads some programs that are idle into swap. But I have memory that's still free. It really has a small footprint, because I don't have any bloat in that installation, and I can add just the things that I need, just the things that I want, and then have a pretty low level machine. I imagine that nowadays people can run Linux servers with Raspberry Pi or something like that, and of course that would be even less power hungry. You would consume even less electricity. But I never got into Raspberry Pi stuff, or even Arduino. I haven't got into that. I've been programming at Mega chips in the transistor testers that you can also buy either in a kit form or pre-assembled already from China, and those are very convenient component testers. In fact, where did I put the one that I have? Here's one that I have. You've got a socket where you can put the component that you want to test in, and then you press the button. The battery seems to be discharged or disconnected or something. it doesn't want to turn on right now. So, but in any case, that's perhaps a story for another day, where we can discuss Chinese clones. It's also came out of an open source project where a couple of German guys designed, the schematics for this components tester, and then the Chinese are, of course, producing clones. With, of course, they modified the schematics a little, or they replaced the components with cheapo components. And so when I ordered the component tester, the first one that arrived was faulty, and I had to take it up with the vendor and say, hey, look, this one is not working. And the vendor resent me another one that has been working. But what I was doing is I was trying to get the faulty one to work, and I discovered that there was a transistor that was burnt out, and the linear voltage regulator was also burnt out. So I replaced those, and it started to work, but it's still limping a little bit. So it may be that the microcontroller chip on it got damaged, but I already purchased spare microcontroller chips, so I can replace it and then burn the original firmware from the two German guys that would allow me to configure the capabilities of the component tester to the way I like it. I already installed a rotary encoder with a push button capability, so I would need that custom firmware to get the rotary encoder usable, because I would have to solder it into a couple of serial interface connections on the microcontroller, and then I would have to compile the firmware with settings and flags turned on that would say, yep, using a rotary encoder, and it's this type of encoder, and so forth. That's the beauty of that project. I mean, there are so many fantastic electronics projects these days. I mean, there's an oscilloscope that I have that some guy developed custom firmware for and made it much more usable and user-friendly with that firmware, and I believe expanded its functionality through the firmware. So just fantastic possibilities for electronics projects. I'm not an expert in electronics, but I keep trying. I keep playing around a little bit, and I'm learning a little bit. I'm learning. So in any case, let's get back to Debian. I'll include the time lapse of the installation. It's probably not going to be clear to see the screen and what's really going on, and because it's a 5-second time lapse, you won't be able to follow it, but it just will demonstrate that yes, it's possible to install current version of Debian on something that is super ancient. I mean, this e-machines is probably 20 years old. That's I don't remember when Windows 95, 98 was. Well, there we go, Windows 98. That's the year 1998, and right now we're in 2018, so that's 20 years old, somewhere between 15 and 20 years old hardware. But that's the beauty of Linux. You can run it on, you can scale it down to really underpowered hardware. But when you do that, you get the ability to use less electricity, and you can embed Linux into devices like dash cams and whatnot, so that that stuff runs on a small lithium-ion battery, and definitely not something that you can do with Windows. I mean, there is embedded Windows versions, but I don't imagine that you can really scale them down as much. In any case, I'll show you the Debian time lapse, and we'll finish with that. But like I said, I was successful. I installed it, it fired up. I don't have X Windows working right now. I will look into that, but that's not super critical for this server. I just need that block device and Samba at the moment. And also there was a prompt during the installation for an SSH server, and I have that installed on there, obviously, so that I can remotely log into the server and control it. And then we'll see what else I would, what other software I would add to the server, to have it be useful. I can, for example, probably get a USB webcam connected and use it as sort of a security device, something like that. Okay, well, have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.